Between 1998 and 2000 in Belize City, a small, peaceful community would be rocked by a series of shocking and brutal murders that terrorized its streets. 5 girls between the ages of 8 and 15 would disappear one after the other, only to be found in the most grisly conditions, mutilated and murdered. The killer would be dubbed the Belizean Jack the Ripper, mainly because of his similarities to the methods used by Jack the Ripper, a serial killer that would terrorize London in the late 19th century. Despite extensive investigation, though, no one was ever arrested or brought to justice. This is the story of those young girls, their lives, their deaths, and the devastating impact on their families and the community. Welcome back, mystery enthusiasts. I'm Lexi, your guide through the shadowy tales of the Caribbean, and you're tuned into Island Mysteries Uncovered. Today, we delve into a chilling chapter from Belize's history, a series of unsolved murders that left the nation in fear and mourning. Before we embark on this journey, though, let's connect across our digital islands. Sail across to our Facebook page, Island Mysteries Uncovered, and give us a like and follow. Then, chart the course to our Instagram, Threads, and TikTok avenues, where you'll find exclusive content and behind-the-scenes glimpses. Finally, drop your anchor back here on YouTube. Like this video, share it with fellow mystery seekers, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to stay updated, and remember, we upload once a week and we sprinkle clues and tidbits throughout the week on our socials, so be sure to stay connected. Now, imagine a peaceful nation with the most idyllic landscapes, where the community operates as one big family. This was actually Belize. In fact, this was most of the Caribbean years ago. Yet between 1998 and 2000, terror lurked, preying on the innocent and casting a long shadow over Belize, a shadow that can be seen and felt even today. This is the haunting story of the Belize Ripper. For context, and so you understand how a series of crimes so gruesome can happen in a place described as so close-knitted, let's take a look at Belize around this time. So during the 1980s, a large amount of immigrants would move to Belize from neighboring Central American countries. And the people were mainly moving from countries such as Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The migration was mainly driven by civil unrest in these countries and economic hardship, and so naturally, people would move to find greener pastures. Quite a large number of these people ended up in Belize. So the influx of immigrants naturally caused a shift in the demographic, and that in turn affected the cultural landscape of the country. See, the people of Belize, like those of nearly all Caribbean countries, they strongly believe that it's not the parents nor the family that's responsible for raising a child. They strongly believe that it takes a community. And I know this all sounds really good and you're wondering, okay, so what's the problem? Well, when you have new people moving into a community, often speaking a different language, from a different background, and with different cultural beliefs, what tends to happen is the vibe would shift from more of a it takes a community to raise a child to everyone for themselves. And this is what most residents believed happened, and this is what they say contributed to what happened to those young girls. I have to say, guys, while researching this case, I found myself getting really emotional. It's one thing to read about a crime, but it's another thing entirely to sit with the reality of these young girls, what their lives could have been, the futures they were robbed of, and to think of the fact that each one of them had dreams and families and people that loved them. Knowing that their killer was never caught and that justice never came to them is honestly heartbreaking. I couldn't help but think about their parents, mothers who probably stayed up waiting for them to come home, and fathers who must have felt helpless, their siblings who grew up with this hole in their lives. This case isn't just about a faceless killer, guys. It's about real children who were taken far too soon. And that's what makes this story so hard to tell, but it's actually really important to share. We tell their stories so that they're not forgotten, so that maybe one day someone out there with the missing piece of the puzzle comes forward and justice can finally be served. That said, we do want to inform you, our listeners, that today's episode covers very sensitive and potentially distressing topics. These include crimes against children, SA, and mutilation. We understand that content like this may be triggering and uncomfortable for some listeners, and if you feel that this episode may be too distressing for you, we encourage you to skip it and join us next week for a different discussion altogether. Your well-being is really important to us, okay? Okay guys, so let's get into it. Now, on the morning of September 8, 1998, 13-year-old Shirley Nichols, who was a 5th grade student at Wesley Upper School in southern Belize City, she was making her way to school like most other children in the neighborhood. Later that evening, when June Gabrielle, Shirley's mom, returned from work, she would immediately notice something was wrong. Shirley, who was usually first of her children to arrive home from school, had not returned. Realizing immediately that something was wrong, June would set off in the direction of Shirley's school to inquire as to her daughter's whereabouts, and this is when she would learn that her daughter actually never attended school that day. By this time, Shirley must have been missing for at least 6 to 8 hours. So during our research, there wasn't much information available surrounding what happened next, but I would imagine June hurried back to her community, frantically searching and reaching out to neighbors and friends of Shirley, trying to figure out if maybe she visited a friend or she skipped school to hang out with friends that day, although in a much later interview, she would say it was really out of character for Shirley to miss school for any reason at all. She absolutely loved learning. She just wasn't one of those children. After her inquiries gave nothing fruitful, I imagine she would have headed straight to the nearest police station where she would have filed a missing persons report. And just to clarify, I know in certain countries a certain amount of time has to pass before you can file a missing persons report, but this isn't the case in Belize. In fact, as soon as you notice that a loved one could potentially be missing, you're encouraged to reach out to authorities. That's how serious they take it. And I can also picture the community coming out to help find this missing child, to rally around the mom, especially considering how usual a disappearance was for the disappearance of a child during this time. Now, despite all the efforts for such a prolonged period of time, little Shirley's body would be found just about a month later on October 9th of the same year, and she would be found in a pool near the George Price Highway, and an autopsy would later reveal that she had been stabbed more than 40 times, mainly to her head and chest. One of her arms was almost completely severed and her face was cut open. Some sources say there was evidence of SA, others dispute it, so we're not entirely sure. The most troubling detail, though, was that Shirley was found wearing clothing that belonged to another young girl who had gone missing just 2 days prior. The clothing belonged to 9-year-old Jay Blades, who would be the second victim. And as heartbreaking as it is, there isn't much details available online related to Jay Blades. So we tried our best to piece together her story as much as we could. So here it goes. On October 7th, just 2 days before Shirley's body was discovered wearing her clothing, 9-year-old Jay Blades would end up missing for the final time. And to put the statement in context as to for the final time, she would first end up in the media on July 20th when she was reported missing. However, on this occasion, she would return home safely. There isn't much details online available as to where she was during that time period or how long she was gone for. But a few months later, she would disappear again for about 4 days between September 25th and 29th. And on this occasion, when she returned home, she would mention to a few of her classmates and her teacher that she was abducted. No one actually believed her. And they would say this is in part because she was known to tell stories. Teachers would say, though, that when she returned on this occasion, there was a clear shift in her personality. She was suddenly withdrawn and she started thumb-sucking. It wasn't thoroughly investigated, though, and I am honestly not sure why, because surely you'd think that even if she was known to tell stories, the shift in her behavior, the thumb-sucking, would prompt investigation, especially considering that another young girl was recently abducted, but it wasn't. Previously, when Shirley's body was discovered, both Jay's mom and Shirley's mom would be called in to assist with the identification of the body. This was mainly because both girls were missing at the time. Not that authorities had any information as to the fact that Shirley was wearing Jay's clothing. Shirley's mother was able to confirm the fact that it was her daughter's body from marks that she had, a birthmark and some other marks that she had on her body. And Jay's mom would express relief at the fact that it wasn't little Jay. She was hopeful. But then she made a startling discovery. The dress little Shirley was wearing was the same green and black dress that little Jay was wearing when she went missing. Another detail that would baffle investigators during the 6-month period that Jay remained missing. It's really strange because during the 6-month period that Jay would remain missing, authorities would receive reports of sightings to no avail. So people were calling in and saying, oh, I saw her at this flat, I saw her in this village, and they would turn up and nothing. And then 6 months later, her tiny skeletal remains would be found. One source would mention that her remains needed to be handed over to the FBI so they could be confirmed as her. And the extent of her injury isn't really known. And I could be wrong, but I think this is in part due to how severely decomposed her body was at the time of discovery. So, yeah. Now, during the time that little Jay Blades remained missing, on March 23rd of 1999, another little girl would end up missing. And this would be 12-year-old Jackie Malik. And she would vanish during recess while on her school's playground. So Jackie's sister would report that on the morning that Jackie went missing, herself, Jackie, and another family friend were en route to school. They were walking to school. And a neighbor of theirs would approach them, offering them a ride to school. She said her sister, Jackie, wanted to take the ride considering that they were already late for school, but she felt she had a bad feeling about it and she said no. So they refused the ride and continued their commute to school. They would arrive at school. The journey was uneventful. During the recess period, she didn't see her sister. It wasn't normal for them to meet up during that period. And then at lunch, they would meet up and journey home for lunch together. It was at that point that she realized she went to meet her sister to go home for lunch and she wasn't able to find her. So she would go to the teacher, the class teacher, to find out, where is she? Like, have you seen her? And that's when the teacher would tell her she never returned to class after recess. At this point, the neighbor, the family friend that walked to school with them, would tell Jackie's sister that during recess, someone asked to speak to her. But she wasn't sure who it was. All she knew is that it was a man in a car. And her sister went to go speak to her. Jackie's sister would report that at this point, she hurried home to go tell her grandmother what had happened. And they immediately went out looking for her. They would look until nightfall, she said, to no avail. And I presume it was at this point that police, the authorities, were contacted and a report was made. However, only 2 days later, her body would be found on March 25th. She was face down in a puddle alongside a dirt road that bordered the area where Shirley's body was found just months prior. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her left arm was severed, and it appeared as if she had been run over by a car. Not long after this, 8-year-old Erica Wills would end up missing, and sadly, her disappearance would go unnoticed for 3 days. See, at the time, Erica was supposed to be spending time with relatives, and they assumed she had just not turned up, like she stayed home with her family. And at the same time, her family assumed she had already gone to the relatives directly from school. And guys, look, I know it's really easy to sit back and say, oh, that could never be me. But we're talking about an entirely different time and setting. A time when in the Caribbean, our parents would go to work, leave us at home, and just mention to a neighbor, you should keep an eye on the children for me there at home. A time when we walked to and from school unaccompanied by any adults, because the adults whose homes we'd pass on our way to school felt a sense of responsibility for our safety. And they would quickly intervene if any situation warranted this. A time where if you're meant to be somewhere, it was just assumed that you arrived there, except if your parents got word. Otherwise, it was just assumed that you arrived. We were literally raised and protected by our village. So that said, it wasn't until little Erica was supposed to return home and didn't that it was noticed that something was wrong, and eventually discovered that she was missing. July 18th though, just 1 week short of a month from when she first went missing, Erica's skeletal remains would be discovered behind a quarry in Grace Rock. And she would be identified by her mother using only a hairband and a tweety ring that she always wore. And again, the extent of her injuries aren't widely available. And I take a leap and assume this is in part due to how severely decomposed she was at the time of discovery. So around this time, the general public, the ambience, everything, it was just tense, and the people were tired. They were frustrated. They were demanding justice, and they were asking for a safe haven, the safe haven that they once had to raise their families. Several candlelight vigils would be held in an effort to remember the victims, to support the families, and because of public pressure, police would end up issuing a curfew to anyone under 16. Despite this, however, there would be one final victim, and on February 15th of 2000, despite the curfew, despite the public unrest, despite the vigils, despite the demands for answers, and despite what I assume would be a much more vigilant general public, 14-year-old Nomi Hernandez would go missing after she was sent out to run errands on Mussel Street. Just 9 days later, her mutilated body would be found on a sandy mound along the Belize River. She had multiple stab wounds to the face and neck, and although not specified, it's noted that she had several missing body parts. She would be identified by her dad by the blue jeans she wore when she disappeared. The series of murders, the nature of the crimes, the selection of the victims, they all caused panic and public unrest. And police would, after imposing the curfew, they would post guards at school to potentially deter any further kidnapping of these young girls. Now, in the months after the final murder, police would receive several tips and reported incidents of a man driving a red car and wearing a mask who had attempted to lure and kidnap young girls. Unsuccessfully, though, thankfully. The person was never located, so there wasn't an arrest or an investigation to say if he was potentially linked to the previous 5 victims mentioned earlier. But during the investigation, in 2000, a pathologist would come forward, Dr. Mario Estraban, and he would reveal a really disturbing detail. He actually noted that prior to being brutally murdered, these girls were actually administered large volumes of drugs and alcohol, which likely immobilized them, and it's at that point when they were tortured. The killer used the same instrument on all 5 victims, and based on the precision of the cuts on the bodies, he believes that the person had some sort of medical background, or at the very least access to surgical equipment. Personally, I found this really disturbing. Now, authorities would entertain the idea that there was potentially more than one perpetrator, and some investigators noted the perpetrator appeared to be targeting girls from poorer backgrounds who were almost predominantly from single-parent homes. Some even went as far as to suggest that the girls were lured using different material things, and this would be somewhat supported by when one of Shirley's teachers would note that she found it strange that Shirley often returned to school from her lunch break. She was often late coming back, and she often returned with little pieces of fruit that was sold by the vendors outside. It's quite normal that vendors would come outside the schools. They'd have fruits peeled, sliced in a bag, and we'd have the option to add salt and pepper to it, and we call it chow chow where I'm from. I'm not sure what you call it where you're from, but I assume that's what they were referring to when they said she returned to school with pieces of fruits. So the teacher would mention that she found it really strange that Shirley's mom, who it was mentioned at the time, she only worked for $63 per week, and she often struggled to afford necessities for her children for schools. She was questioning how is Shirley able to afford fruits from a street vendor outside when they're basically struggling to make ends meet. And in another case, one of the other girls, Jackie, was reported to have brought home new clothes and money, which would raise questions among her family and even neighbors as to where she was getting these things from. And I'm just mentioning this because it was mentioned as a part of, it's one of the details that we found during our research. It's not to say in any way that these innocent girls are to be blamed or in any way responsible for what happened to them. It's just one aspect that investigators explored during their investigation. So there was some arrests made during the investigation of the case. So remember earlier we mentioned that Jackie's sister would say that one of their neighbors offered them a ride to school. He was called Michael Williams. He was a 40-year-old mechanic, and he was in fact their neighbor. So he would be arrested, and police would look into the possibility that he was potentially responsible for her. He was released, and then when her body was found, he was rearrested and charged with the murder. While in jail, though, one of the things that made it stick a bit when it came to him is that during the period of time that he was arrested after Jackie's body was found, he was in jail. Another woman would come forward and say that when she was younger, about 10 years ago, he essayed her. So they were entertaining the fact that maybe this is a pattern for him. He would eventually be exonerated, though, based on several facts. So during the time he was arrested, little Erica would disappear. Also, many of his customers, because remember we said he was a mechanic, many of his customers came forward with solid alibis saying he was definitely at his shop on this day, and one of them was even a police officer. So because his whereabouts were able to be confirmed during the time that Jackie went missing and another victim disappeared, during the time he was incarcerated, he would be exonerated of all crimes. There was just insufficient evidence linking him to the crime. Now, 5 other men would also be arrested, and they were quickly released due to lack of evidence linking them to the case. And one of the senior investigators would mention in an interview that he felt like these guys were arrested because of public pressure on the police to provide justice for them. It was suggested at some point that Lonnie David Franklin Jr., who was the American serial killer that became known as the Grim Sleeper, because of the 14-year break between his known murders, which lasted from about 1988 to 2002, people entertained the idea that he was potentially linked to these cases, that he could be a suspect because of his connection to Belize through his wife, whose name we won't mention, but she was from Belize. But there was only ever circumstantial evidence found surrounding his connection to the case. So the break in his murders, remember we mentioned there was a 14-year break in his murders in the US. The break in his murders in LA matched the period where the Belize Ripper was active. So that was one of the things. Also, one of the victims' aunt states that she saw him in Belize City during the time the murders were taking place. And finally, his van, using one of the proven crimes, would be found in Belize during police investigation. So although there is some circumstantial evidence of his involvement, though, it wasn't enough. I don't know if authorities had investigated further, if they would have found more, but it wasn't enough to have him charged for these murders. He would never be charged for these crimes, and he would eventually die at San Quentin State Prison, where he served for his known crimes. So years later, in 2002, just the other day, Belize National Forensic Services, they opened a new lab dedicated to solving cold cases within the country. And naturally, people became hopeful. And being one of their most infamous cases, the citizens immediately assumed this would be one of the cases that would be put at the forefront to be reinvestigated, to be revisited. The director of the investigation would say during an interview that the evidence relating to the Belize Ripper murders it still had usable DNA, which would be scanned. However, as of right now, there is still no new information, no new leads, and no arrests were made. So I would mention that during the time that these 5 young girls were going missing and their little bodies were being found, there were 2 additional girls that went missing and their bodies would be found. However, we won't mention their names or go in depth about their stories because arrests were made, these cases were closed, and they essentially had justice, all right? That said, if you guys have any information at all that could potentially help in this case, if you think you have the missing piece, even if it's a small detail, we encourage you to reach out to the local authorities, and we've linked them below in the description. There is also the option to do this anonymously if that's a concern of yours, all right? So what do you guys think happened? Do you think it was potentially the work of the Grim Sleeper during his break? Let me know in the comments, all right? And before we end this, today we take a moment to remember Shirley Nichols, who was just 13 when she disappeared on September 8th. She would be 40 years old today. Little 9-year-old Jay Blades when she went missing in 1998. She would be 35 years old today. Jackie Malik, who was only 12 at the time. She would be 38 today. Little Erica Wells, who was only a baby. She was 8 years old at the time she disappeared. She would be 34 years old today. And finally, Nomi Hernandez, who was 14 years old at the time of her death. She would be 39 years old today. May their memories live on and may they rest in peace. Thank you for joining us on this episode, guys. We really appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed this discussion, please consider subscribing to our channel and following us on our social media for updates. Your engagement really helps us to continue bringing you meaningful content. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay tuned for our next episode.